Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I have done it again. I bought way too many books in the month of May, and that's what I'm here for today. I'm going to talk about them. This is the pile right here, and it continues down, lower. I bought a lot. Basically, if you follow along, you know, we expanded the library in January, and the added space has made me feel a little more cavalier about bringing books into my library. But I will give myself some credit. I think I am doing a pretty good job bringing in books that I want and intend to read or would like to continue to have on my library. We'll see how that works in future book haul revisits. I'll have a link to my last book haul and my last book haul revisit down below where I look back at previous book hauls and see how many of those books I have read. So there's a lot. There's a lot. And in my defense, this book haul includes Independent Bookstore Day, which was at the end of April. I went to Montana Book Company and supported them for that day. So some of these are Independent Bookstore Day purchases. And then just this past weekend, as I'm filming this, Joel and I went to Bozeman, Montana for the Pride there. And we went to 2 different bookstores to support their drag story hours. It was a whole thing. I'll talk about it in my Friday Reads video this week. But, you know, we wanted to support those stores for having those story hours. So purchase more books too. So there are a lot of reasons that this is a large book haul. Let's just start getting into it and work our way through these books. I am excited about all of them, which is a good thing, because imagine if I was not excited about these books. So the first book that I brought into my library was something I purchased from Montana Book Company on Independent Bookstore Day. It's Flamer by Mike Curato. This is something that is published by Henry Holt. I purchased it because this is a frequently banned book, so I wanted to support Montana Book Company on Independent Bookstore Day, and I wanted to support a banned book. This is a graphic novel. Here's a sample of the illustration inside, and basically, here's the quick description of it. It's the summer between middle school and high school, and Aiden Navarro is away at camp. Everyone's going through changes, but for Aiden, the stakes feel higher. As he navigates friendships, deals with bullies, and spends time with Elias, a boy he can't stop thinking about, he finds himself on a path of self-discovery and acceptance. And it just feels typical that books about self-discovery and acceptance are things that people ban. And I can't explain it. I can't explain it, but it's disappointing. So this should be a fairly quick read. I'm thinking I will probably try to read this in Pride Month, because in Pride Month, I like to focus on LGBTQIA+ books and authors and stories. So it's a natural fit. And because it's a graphic novel, it seems like it would be pretty quick to read. So that should work pretty well. Usually in a book haul, I will read a little bit from the beginning. Doesn't quite make sense to do that for a graphic novel, so I'm just going to show you the opening. Let's do 2 pages, since that one didn't really have a whole lot. Looks like it should be interesting. We'll see how that goes. That's Flamer by Mike Curato, the first book I brought into my library in the month of May, and I actually purchased it on Independent Bookstore Day at the end of April at Montana Book Company. Moving right along, we have Wandering Souls by Cecile. This is something that had been on the long list for the Women's Prize, did not make the short list, and it had sounded interesting to me when the long list was announced. I'll put my short list reaction video down below, or the long list video. I'll put one of them down below so you can check it out. It sounded interesting to me immediately. I didn't run out and grab any of the books. And when it did not make the short list, a lot of people commented to say that they had read it and they thought it was something that I would like, although it's a very sad book. So I immediately felt like I had to get a copy of the book. The American cover has the phases of the moon, and I didn't even realize, Joel had to point it out to me, that there are 3 faces hidden in the phases of the moon. And this is a book about 3 siblings. So kind of cool. This is also published by Henry Holt. Here is the quick description of it. In the years that follow the Vietnam War, Anne and her brothers immigrate to the UK, living first in overcrowded camps and resettlement centers, and then later in a modernizing London plagued by social inequality. Anne works in a factory to pay the bills. Min loiters about with fellow high school dropouts. Tan, the youngest, plays soccer with his friends after class. As they mature, each sibling reckons with survivor's guilt, unmoored by their parents' absence, and with every choice, their paths diverge further until it's unclear if love alone can keep them together. I have heard so many good things about this book. I've heard that it's sad, kind of emotionally devastating, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'm hoping that I will manage to fit it in this year. So this one, let's definitely read a little bit from the opening of the book. Part 1, Chapter 1, November 1978, Vung Tam, Vietnam. There are the goodbyes and then the fishing out of the bodies. Everything in between is speculation. In the years to come, Tian would let the harrowing memories of the boat and the camp trickle out of her until they were nothing but a whisper. But she would hold on to that last evening with all her might, from the smell of the steaming rice in the kitchen to the touch of her mother's skin as she embraced her for the last time. That is the opening of Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin. Really looking forward to reading this. I've heard so many good things about it. I mean, so many good things. Now let's jump to this past weekend as I'm filming this, when we went to Bozeman Pride. The first store we went to was Wheatgrass Books in Livingston, Montana, a really delightful store in a fairly small town. And they hosted a drag story hour. They have a really great fiction section. There were actually a lot of books to choose from. I chose In the Distance by Hernan Diaz as a book that I wanted to purchase from them. They also had really great gift cards, and we bought a bunch of greeting cards. I'm sorry, not gift cards, greeting cards. We purchased a bunch of them, and In the Distance was the book that I purchased. You probably remember Hernan Diaz just co-won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for 2023. He won for Trust, and Barbara Kingsolver won for Demon Copperhead. I did a whole reaction to the Pulitzer announcement. I'll have it down below. I also did a deep dive on both Demon Copperhead and Trust. I'll link that down below. I was already interested in reading In the Distance. I didn't quite like Trust. It's a novel in 4 parts, and I only really liked one of them, but I think there is good writing in there. There was a lot of skill in there. So I kind of play out all the complicated thoughts I had about Trust in the deep dive. But I was curious to go back and read Hernan Diaz's previous book, which was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Obviously, Trust ended up winning, but this one was just a finalist, and it lost to Less by Andrew Sean Greer, which to me is kind of inexplicable. I can't explain it. Anyway, I am interested in reading this, but then the fact that Hernan Diaz is now part of the Pulitzer family, I'm doing a project where I'm reading all of the books that have won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and now Hernan Diaz is part of that family. I'm very curious about other works by Pulitzer Prize winning authors. And again, he's part of that family now. So even if I hadn't already been interested in The Distance, I would kind of be gravitating in that direction anyway. Here is the quick description of it. By the way, it's a really stunning jacket design as well. Very fun. A young Swedish immigrant finds himself penniless and alone in California. The boy travels east in search of his brother, moving on foot against the great current of emigrants pushing west. Driven back again and again, he meets naturalists, criminals, religious fanatics, swindlers, Indians, and lawmen, and his exploits turn him into a legend. Diaz defies the conventions of historical fiction and genre, offering a probing look at the stereotypes that populate our past and a portrait of radical foreignness. I mean, it sounds interesting. Really interesting. I pronounced the word conventions a little weirdly, I think, but that's fine. We're going to just leave it in and keep going. I'm really looking forward to reading this. This is published by Coffee House Press, and here is the opening of the book. A pair of hands came out of the water and groped for the edges of the angular hole. It took the searching fingers some time to climb up the thick inner walls of the opening, which resembled the cliffs of a miniature canyon, and find their way to the surface. Having reached over the edge, they hooked into the snow and pulled. A head emerged. The swimmer opened his eyes and looked ahead at the even, horizonless expanse. His long white hair and beard were threaded with straw-tinted strands. Nothing in him revealed agitation. If he was out of breath, the vapor of his exhalations was invisible in the uncolored background. He rested his elbows and chest on the shallow snow and turned around. That's the opening of In the Distance by Hernan Diaz, recent Pulitzer Prize winner for fiction. We're going to stay with this past weekend as I'm filming this and talk about Sharks in the Time of Saviors by Kawai Strong Washburn. So the other drag story hour that we went to was at Country Bookshelf in Bozeman proper. And again, I'll talk about the experience of the drag story hours in my Friday Reads video because white supremacists actually did show up at both events, the same ones. And it was kind of scary. But we really wanted to show up to support the Drag Story Hour, and we really wanted to support the stores. So that's why I made sure we made some purchases at Wheatgrass Books, and we wanted to make sure we purchased things at Country Bookshelf as well. I had already picked out 2 books. We'll get to them later in the book haul. But I decided to do something a little different, and it was actually ended up being really fun. So I don't know if this is going to be something I continue to do as I visit independent bookstores, because you know I love to support independent bookstores. There was this one bookseller in particular, I did not get her name, who was very helpful and really sweet. And I asked her, what is a book that you think more people should read? She immediately had an answer, and that answer was Sharks in the Time of Saviors. Now, I have heard people talk about this book when it was originally published, and it has kind of faded since then. And what she said was it was published at the beginning of 2020. Obviously, other things happened and sort of spun out from there. And I just feel like the book didn't get the due that it should have gotten if it had been published any other year at any other time. And I would love more people to read it. She also recommended another book, but I ultimately chose this one because it sounded really particularly fascinating. She says it deals with the impacts of colonialism and things like that. And it just, I'd heard good things about it when it was published. So her bringing it back up really sold it very hard. And yeah, I couldn't say no. She did a very good job. And she had a really interesting answer to that question. So I couldn't do anything but purchase the book, and now I am hoping I will manage to read it this year. Here is the quick description. In 1995, Kailua Kona, Hawaii, on a rare family vacation, 7-year-old Nainoa Flores falls overboard on a cruise ship into the Pacific Ocean. When a shiver of sharks appears in the water, everyone fears for the worst. But instead, Noah is gingerly delivered to his mother in the jaws of a shark, marking his story as the stuff of legends. Nainoa's family, struggling amidst the collapse of the sugarcane industry, hails his rescue as a sign of favor from ancient Hawaiian gods, a belief that appears validated after he exhibits puzzling new abilities. But as time passes, this supposed divine favor begins to drive the family apart. Sounds like a really fascinating book. Definitely a premise that probably wouldn't be for everyone. I think it sounds fascinating, and again, she sold it really well, and I am looking forward to reading it. This is published by Picador, and here is from a section from the opening. Part 1, Deliverance, Chapter 1, Malia, 1995, Hanoka. When I close my eyes, we're all still alive, and it becomes obvious then what the gods want from us. The myth people tell about us might start on that liquid blue day off Kona and the sharks, but I know different. We started earlier. You started earlier. The kingdom of Hawaii had long been broken, the breathing rainforests and singing green reefs crushed under the hail fists of beach resorts and skyscrapers, and that was when the land had begun calling. I know this now because of you, and that the gods were hungry for change, and you were that change. In our first days, I saw so many signs, but didn't believe. That is the opening of Sharks in the Time of Saviors by Kawai Strong Washburn. Really looking forward to this. And again, that is why independent booksellers are so good. She immediately had an answer. She didn't even hesitate when I asked that question. I thought that would stump her. I even framed it as, you can think about it if you need some time. And she was like, no, I got an answer. And she knocked it out of the park. That's somebody who really understood the assignment. Now, let's talk about 84 Charing Cross Road. If you follow along, I read this book already, and I loved it, and I've been on a quest to find a copy of it. And I really want a used copy of it because in the book, the author talks about used books and how much she loves them. So it felt only appropriate that I would track down a used copy. Now, I read it in February, I think, and it's taken me this long to find a copy of the book. But I did it. I finally did it. I went into my local used bookstore, and a copy had magically appeared on the shelf. Not magically at all. It had been stocked, and I grabbed it. I had secretly been hoping that I would get the one that has an introduction by Anne Bancroft, because Anne Bancroft starred as Helene Hanff in the film version of 84 Charing Cross Road, which, by the way, is also amazing. It stars Anthony Hopkins, Anne Bancroft, and Judi Dench. It's really good. If you are unfamiliar, 84 Charing Cross Road it's a nonfiction book about it's letters that are sent between Helene Hanff and primarily a man named Frank Dole, who is a bookseller at Marks and Company in London. It starts out pretty simple. She lives in New York and she is writing them to sort of order books and have them help her track down copies of books that she would like. And over time, they develop a very friendly relationship, and it becomes a very strong friendship over the course of, I think, 20 years, and changes her lives, their lives, and it's a really beautiful story. And I loved it. Joel loved it. And we really wanted to have a copy. I'm glad I finally found one. This edition is published by Moyer Bell. Somebody did ask on Instagram when I posted that I found this if it has any underlining in it. It does not. There are no notes in it. It does have the name of someone who owned this copy in the past, but otherwise it is pretty pristine. Anne Bancroft's introduction is great, very short, which is in keeping with the book. And here is the first letter. Gentlemen, your ad in the Saturday Review of Literature says that you specialize in out-of-print books. The phrase antiquarian booksellers scares me somewhat, as I equate antique with expensive. I am a poor writer with an antiquarian taste in books, and all the things I want are impossible to get over here except in very expensive rare editions or in Barnes & Noble's grimy marked-up schoolbook copies. I enclose a list of my most pressing problems. If you have clean secondhand copies of any of the books on the list for no more than $5 each, will you consider this a purchase order and send them to me? Very truly yours, Helene Hanff. That is how this relationship begins. I love this book. It's very good. I'm glad I finally have a copy for my library. Now, let's flash back to Independent Bookstore Day. I was talking with Charlie and Chelsea, the owners of Montana Book Company, on Independent Bookstore Day, and I was talking with them about things that they have recently read. Chelsea has been obsessed with Eric LaRocca, which she said is interesting because these are not the type of book that she would usually read. Charlie was really on board because Charlie is a huge fan of Chuck Wendig, and Chuck Wendig has been a big proponent of Eric LaRocca and wrote an introduction to this book. So Chelsea has basically devoured all of Eric LaRocca's books, and I was a little hesitant because this does not sound like the type of thing I would usually read, but Chelsea says it's not the type of thing she would usually read, but she just found them really fascinating and would be very curious to hear what Joel and I would think of them. So we asked her, which one is your favorite? She said The Trees Grew Because I Bled There. It's a story collection, and here is what it says online. 8 stories of literary dark fiction from a master storyteller. Exploring the shadow side of love, these are tales of grief, obsession, control. Intricate examinations of trauma and tragedy in raw, poetic prose. In these narratives, a woman imagines horrific scenarios whilst caring for her infant niece. Online posts chronicle a cancer diagnosis. A couple in the park with their small child encounter a stranger with horrific consequences. A toxic relationship reaches a terrifying resolution. So it'll be interesting. It's not a very long book. I'm going to give it a try. I've committed to that. So I don't know. It doesn't sound like something I would pick out for myself, but that's part of the joy of independent bookstores. They challenge you to get outside of your typical area and read things that you might not. It's worked in the past with Montana Book Company. They've had me read things that I wouldn't have picked out for myself, and it's gone well. So hopefully this will be the same. We'll find out. We will find out. If you've read Eric LaRocca, please let me know what you thought. I might try to fit this in June because there are definitely queer elements of this. The cover is gorgeous, by the way. Creepy, sure, but in a pretty way. All right, so there's an introduction from Chuck Wendig, and then the first story in this collection, which, by the way, is published by Titan Books, is You Will Follow Wherever They Go, and it opens... Why don't you go out there and introduce yourself? He asks me with a charm I had forgotten he possessed, a grin so cloying that a magician might redden. My eyes drifted out the rain-spattered window, watching the group of children crowd near the entrance to our driveway, a coterie of adolescents wearing dark-colored costumes made of papier-mâché and toting bright Chinese lanterns. That is the opening of the first story of The Trees Grew Because I Bled There by Eric LaRocca. Bookseller recommendation from people I tend to trust very much. Now, also in the month of May, the Carol Shields Prize announced its first winner. And in the discussion to that, I started thinking a lot about Carol Shields. And one thing that really accelerated that was that Sean the Book Maniac did an interview with the CEO of the Carol Shields Prize. And he talked about Various Miracles, which is a collection of stories from Carol Shields, and it just sounded really flawless. And again, I am particularly intrigued by Pulitzer authors, people who are in the Pulitzer family. Carol Shields won a Pulitzer Prize for The Stone Diaries, but I've never read anything else. No, it's not true. I have read another book by hers, unless. But this sounded really interesting, so I checked my local used bookstore the next time I was in there, and they had a copy, so I grabbed it. The small miracles of our day-to-day lives are on captivating display in this unforgettable collection by Pulitzer Prize winner Carol Shields. Various Miracles brings together 21 short stories, modern parables that illuminate the mysteries of everyday existence. Can't wait to read it. Carol Shields is an author I am particularly interested in revisiting because I read The Stone Diaries when I was around 20 years old, and I don't think I was ready for it. I think I was very closed off. I think I would understand what the book is doing much better at this age than I would have back then. So she is an author I'm really interested in revisiting as part of my Pulitzer Prize project, and that should be very interesting. She has been gone for, almost 20 years, I think. What is time? This edition was published by Fourth Estate. The first story in the collection is called Hazel, and it begins, after a man has mistreated a woman, he feels a need to do something nice, which she must accept. In line with this way of thinking, Hazel has accepted from her husband Brian sprays of flowers, trips to Hawaii, extravagant compliments on her rather ordinary cooking, bracelets of dull-colored silver and copper, a dressing gown in green tartan wool, a second dressing gown with marabou trim around the hem and sleeves, dinners in expensive revolving restaurants, and once a tender kiss, tenderly delivered, on the instep of her right foot. But there will be no more such compensatory gifts, for Brian died last December of heart failure. That is the opening of the first story in the collection Various Miracles by Carol Shields, part of the Pulitzer Prize family of authors. And speaking of the Pulitzer Prize family of authors, here is Hue and Cry, another story collection by James Allen McPherson. He won the Pulitzer Prize, I want to say in 1978, for a story collection called Elbow Room. He was the first African-American winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And I had never seen another book by him because largely the book of his that people remember is Elbow Room because it won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And it looks like this one was recently reprinted by, it doesn't have a logo on the side. So this is published by The Art of the Story. So it's back, and I just would much be interested because I've heard really good things about Elbow Room and about his work in general. Here's the description online. Hue and Cry is the remarkably mature and agile debut story collection from James Allen McPherson, one of America's most venerated and most original writers. McPherson's characters, gritty, authentic, and pristinely rendered, give voice to unheard struggles along the dividing lines of race and poverty in subtle, fluid prose that bears no trace of sentimentality, agenda, or apology. I'm really looking forward to exploring his work because I've never read one of his books, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So, the first story in this collection is called A Matter of Vocabulary. It begins, Thomas Brown stopped going to church at 12 after one Sunday morning when he had been caught playing behind the minister's pulpit by several deacons who had come up into the room early to count the money they had collected from the other children in the Sunday school downstairs. Thomas had seen them putting some of the change in their pockets, and they had seen him trying to hide behind the big worn brown pulpit with the several black Bibles and the pitcher of ice water and the glass used by the minister in the more passionate parts of his sermons. It was a Southern Baptist church. That is the beginning of Hue and Cry by James Allen McPherson, another member of the Pulitzer Prize family of authors, and someone who I'm really looking forward to trying, hopefully soon. I want to get to his fiction hopefully soon. Then we have David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. If you follow along, you know Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver was my favorite book last year. I had never read David Copperfield before, and obviously I didn't intend to after I read Demon Copperhead first, but I've been thinking about going back and reading David Copperfield. Joel found a used copy in his travels for work, and here it is. So if you know Demon Copperhead, you know the story of David Copperfield. This is a semi-autobiographical book by Charles Dickens about a boy who is lost in workhouses and poverty and neglect as a child, and who manages to get through it ultimately. And it is if it's anything like Demon Copperhead, it's going to be a beautiful and powerful story. I've heard that it simmers with Dickens's rage about social inequalities and systemic problems that led to the sort of childhood that David Copperfield and Charles Dickens had. And I think it will be an interesting book to read. Let me find the beginning of it. Chapter 1, I Am Born. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I have been informed and believe, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike, and I began to cry simultaneously. That is the famous opening of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This takes us to a book that was recommended in comments by Great Books Guy. Thank you, Great Books Guy. This is the Pulitzer Prize novels, A Critical Backward Look by W.J. Stuckey, second edition. So it was originally published, I think, in 1966, and then this second edition was published in 1981, I believe. Yes, 1981 by the University of Oklahoma Press. This is pretty much exactly what the cover promises. W.J. Stuckey looks at each of the books that have won the Pulitzer Prize up to that point and critiques them, which is going to be very valuable for me in my Pulitzer Prize project, especially with some of the older books. It's hard to find the context of the time when it comes to other older books that are way before my time. So hopefully this will help. I believe Great Books Guy said that W.J. Stuckey can be a bit elitist, a bit snobby, but having perspective on these books and what was going on at the time that made them the Pulitzer Prize winning book will hopefully be very helpful to me. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this one since it's very niche to my interest, but let's do just a quick thing from the opening of the book. Chapter 1, Joseph Pulitzer and His Prizes. The life story of Joseph Pulitzer, founder of the Pulitzer Prizes in journalism, letters, and music, fits beautifully into a familiar pattern of American success. Pulitzer arrived in this country in 1864 at the age of 17, without money and with almost no competence in the English language. By a combination of hard work, shrewdness, thrift, perseverance, some luck, and some opportunism, he made his way relentlessly to financial eminence. When he died in 1911, Pulitzer left a fortune of almost $19 million, including two large and prosperous newspapers, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the New York World. That is the opening of the Pulitzer Prize novels, A Critical Backward Look by W.J. Stuckey, which will be enormously helpful to me in my Pulitzer Prize project, I believe. Now, let's get back to this past weekend as I'm filming this. After we finished attending the drag story hours and standing with these stores as they stood against hate groups, Joel took me to a used bookstore in Bozeman that he found in his travels. Now, I have been wanting to collect the entire works of Toni Morrison and Louise Erdrich. We'll get to Louise Erdrich in a minute. I have a couple of Toni Morrison books we're going to run through. Toni Morrison, by the way, is part of the Pulitzer Prize family of authors, and I've seen Paradise a couple of times, so I was a little bit picky about which edition of the book I was going to pick up. I wanted it to be good quality. I figured I had the leeway to be a little bit picky since there are so many of this out there in used bookstores. I was just double checking to see if it's a first edition. It is not, but that's fine. It's in really good condition. It is a hardcover. This is published by Alfred A. Knopf. We went to Isle of Books, which is a used bookstore in Bozeman, and I was still wearing my Protect Trans Kids shirt, and the lady there walked up and wanted to shake my hand for wearing the t-shirt. And we had a really lovely conversation about pride and taking care of kids and not hating them, and it was great. So even if this hadn't been a copy of this book that was in great condition, I really just wanted to support her store anyway. So here's what Paradise is about. They shoot the white girl first. With the rest, they can take their time. So begins Toni Morrison's Paradise, which opens with a horrifying scene of mass violence and chronicles its genesis in an all-black small town in rural Oklahoma. Founded by the descendants of freed slaves and survivors in exodus from a hostile world, the patriarchal community of Ruby is built on righteousness, rigidly enforced moral law, and fear. But 17 miles away, another group of exiles has gathered in a promised land of their own, and it's upon these women in flight from death and despair that 9 male citizens of Ruby will lay their pain, their terror, and their murderous rage. I'm a big fan of Toni Morrison's work. I've been slowly working my way through all of her novels, and I'm looking forward to this one. I think that one of the other books I got is the one I want to do next, but I would like to read all of her books at some point. So we know how this begins, but here's a little more. They shoot the white girl first. With the rest, they can take their time. No need to hurry out here. They are 17 miles from a town which has 90 miles between it and any other. Hiding places will be plentiful in the convent, but there is time and the day has just begun. That's the opening of Paradise by Toni Morrison, another author in the Pulitzer Prize family. And then we have Home, which Joel got for me when he discovered Wheatgrass Books in Livingston and brought home for me because he knows I've been collecting all of Toni Morrison's books. I'm sorry, I just nudged the tripod. It'll be fine. This is published by Vintage. And when Frank Money joined the army to escape his too small world, he left behind his cherished and fragile little sister, C. After the war, he journeys to his native Georgia with a renewed sense of purpose in search of his sister, but it becomes clear that their troubles began well before their wartime separation. Together, they return to their rural hometown of Lotus, where buried secrets are unearthed and where Frank learns at last what it means to be a man, what it takes to heal, and above all, what it means to come home. This was actually the first Toni Morrison book that I read. It is, I would say, not her most powerful by any stretch of the imagination. People frequently ask me for recommendations about where to start with Toni Morrison. I always recommend The Bluest Eye because it is one of her less difficult books and it really sets the tone. This would be a good second option if you don't feel that The Bluest Eye is a good place to start. If you're worried that, because there are a lot of triggers in The Bluest Eye, this would probably be a good place to start because, again, it's not one of her more heavy books. It's not one of her more difficult books to get through. I would just say Bluest Eye is a better place to start because it really gets into the theme of Toni Morrison's work in a better way. So if you're only going to read one Toni Morrison book and you're too afraid to jump to like Beloved or The Song of Solomon, Bluest Eye is a better place to start. However, you can't really go wrong with Home if you want a sort of baby step. So we have two more Toni Morrison books. The next one is Sula, which is probably the next one that I would really love to read. And I'm really glad that I found this beautiful hardcover edition of it because, again, this is one that I've heard a lot of really great things about. And I'm a big fan of her work, and this is probably the one that I want to read next. So I'm glad that I was able to find a nice copy of it. Nell and Sula's devotion is fierce enough to withstand bullies and the burden of a dreadful secret. It endures even after Nell has grown up to be a pillar of the black community and Sula has become a pariah. But their friendship ends in an unforgivable betrayal. Or does it end? Terrifying, comic, ribald, and tragic, Sula is a work that overflows with life. I've heard a lot of really great things about this book, and I am very eager to get to it at some point. This is published by Hanff, and it begins in that place where they tore the nightshade and blackberry patches from their roots to make room for the Medallion City golf course. There was once a neighborhood. It stood in the hills above the valley town of Medallion and spread all the way to the river. It is called the suburbs now, but when black people lived there, it was called the bottom. One road shaded by beeches, oaks, maples, and chestnuts connected it to the valley. The beeches are gone now, and so are the pear trees where children sat and yelled down through the blossoms to passerby. Generous funds have been allotted to level the stripped and faded buildings that clutter the road from Medallion up to the golf course. They are going to raise the time-and-a-half pool hall where feet in long tan shoes once pointed down from their chair rungs. A steel ball will knock to dust Irene's palace of cosmetology, where women used to lean their heads back on sink trays and doze while Irene lathered new Nile into their hair. Men in khaki work clothes will pry loose the slats of Reba's grill, where the owner cooked in her hat because she couldn't remember the ingredients without it. That is the opening of Sula by Toni Morrison. Really looking forward to that as well. The final Toni Morrison book is Tar Baby, which I picked up at Country Bookshelf just this past weekend as I am filming this. This edition is from Vintage, and here's what it says. J. Dean Childs is a black fashion model with a white patron, a white boyfriend, and a coat made out of 90 perfect sealskins. Sun is a black fugitive who embodies everything she loathes and desires. As Morrison follows their affair, which plays out from the Caribbean to Manhattan and the Deep South, she charts all the nuances of obligation and betrayal between blacks and whites, masters and servants, and men and women. I love Toni Morrison, so eventually I would love to read all of her books. This one opens, he believed he was safe. He stood at the railing of HMS Store Königsgarten and sucked in great gulps of air, his heart pounding in sweet expectation as he stared at the harbor. Queen of France blushed a little in the lessening light and lowered her lashes before his gaze. 7 girlish white cruisers bobbed in the harbor, but a mile or so down current was a deserted pier. Carefully casual, he went below to the quarters he shared with the others, who had gone on shore leave, and since he had no things to gather, no book of postage stamps, no razor blade, or key to any door, he merely folded more tightly the blanket corners under the mattress of his bunk. That's the opening of Tar Baby by Toni Morrison. Kurt Vonnegut used to be my favorite author. I think he has been supplanted by E.M. Forster, but I have a bunch of his books, and when Joel was at Wheatgrass the first time, he found 2 that I didn't own. I was shocked that I didn't own a copy of Slaughterhouse-Five. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this. This is from Dial Press. But Kurt Vonnegut was in World War II, and he survived the bombing of Dresden, which is a horrific thing that happened. And this book deals with the bombing of Dresden, but it's also very kind of out there in a very Kurt Vonnegut way. And I just don't know how I didn't own a copy. I must have at some point, and it just kind of vanished. I don't know how, but that's my only explanation for it. So when Joel asked me, do you own a copy of Slaughterhouse-Five? I'm glad I looked, because my inclination was just to say, yes, of course I do. It's his most famous book. But I didn't. So here it is, and here is the opening. Chapter 1. All this happened more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. That is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And I have not read Jailbird, one of the few that I have not read, so Joel picked that one up for me as well. Jailbird takes us into a fractured, comic, pure Vonnegut world of high crimes and misdemeanors in government and in the heart. This wry tale follows bumbling bureaucrat Walter F. Starbuck from Harvard to the Nixon White House to the penitentiary as Watergate's least-known co-conspirator. But the humor turns dark when Vonnegut shines his spotlight on the cold hearts and calculated greed of the mighty, giving a razor-sharp edge to an unforgettable portrait of power and politics in our times. This one is also published by Dial Press, and it begins... Oh, there's a prologue. Let's just do the prologue. Yes, Kilgore Trout is back again. He could not make it on the outside. That is no disgrace. A lot of good people can't make it on the outside. That takes us to Louise Erdrich, the other author I'm collecting all of the books of, and I've made a lot of really good progress pretty quickly. First is Tales of Burning Love. Joel found this at a used bookstore in Billings for me. Stranded in a North Dakota blizzard, Jack Mauser's former wives huddle for warmth and pass the endless night by remembering the stories of how each came to love, marry, and ultimately move beyond Jack. At times painful, at times heartbreaking, and oftentimes comic, their tales become the adhesive that holds them together in their love for Jack and in their lives as women. This is published by Harper Perennial, and here is a bit from Part 1, Jack of Sunflowers. Chapter 1, Easter Snow, 1981, Williston, North Dakota. Holy Saturday is an oil boom town with no insurance. Toothache. From his rent-by-the-week motel unit, Jack Mauser called 6 numbers. His jawbone throbbed, silver-fine needles sank and disappeared. A handful of aspirin was no help. A rock, maybe better, something to bang his head against. He tried, but he could not get numb. The stray cat he had allowed to sleep in the bathtub eased against his pant legs. That is the opening of Tales of Burning Love by Louise Erdrich, another book to add to my pile of books from her. Then we have Shadow Tag by Louise Erdrich. When Irene America discovers that her artist husband, Gil, has been reading her diary, she begins a secret blue notebook, stashed securely in a safe deposit box. There she records the truth about her life and marriage, while turning her red diary, hidden where Gil will find it, into a manipulative charade. As Irene and Gil fight to keep up appearances for their 3 children, their home becomes a place of increasing violence and secrecy, and Irene drifts into alcoholism, moving ever closer to ultimate destruction of a relationship filled with shadowy needs and strange ironies. This is also published by Harper Perennial, and it opens November 2nd, 2007, Blue Notebook. I have 2 diaries now. The first is the hardbound red daily reminder of the type I have been writing in since 1994 when we had Florian. You gave me the first book in order to record my beginning year as a mother. It was very sweet of you. I have written in a book like it ever since. They are hidden in the bottom of a drawer in my office, covered with ribbons and wrapping paper. The latest, the one that interests you at present, is kept in the very back of a file cabinet containing old bank statements, checks left over from defunct accounts, the sorts of things we both vow to shred every year but end up stuffing into files. After quite a lot of searching, I expect you have found my red diary. You have been reading it in order to discover whether I am deceiving you. The second diary, what you might call my real diary, is the one I am writing in now. That is the opening of Shadow Tag by Louise Erdrich. And the final book for this really large book haul is Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. Again, Harper Perennial is the publisher. Here's what it says. This is a big sort of departure for her. The world as we know it is ending. Evolution has reversed itself, affecting every living creature on Earth. Science cannot stop the world from running backwards as woman after woman gives birth to infants that appear to be primitive species of humans. 26-year-old Cedar Hawk Songmaker, adopted daughter of a pair of big-hearted, open-minded Minneapolis liberals, is as disturbed and uncertain as the rest of America around her. But for Cedar, this change is profound and deeply personal. She is 4 months pregnant. Though she wants to tell the adoptive parents who raised her from infancy, Cedar first feels compelled to find her birth mother, Mary Potts, an Ojibwe living on the reservation, to understand both her and her baby's origins. As Cedar goes back to her own biological beginnings, society around her begins to disintegrate, fueled by a swelling panic about the end of humanity. It begins, Part 1, August 7. When I tell you that my name is Cedar Hawk Songmaker and that I am the adopted child of Minneapolis liberals, and that when I went looking for my Ojibwe parents and found that I was born Mary Potts, I hid the knowledge, maybe you'll understand. Or not. I'll write this anyway because ever since last week things have changed. Apparently, nobody knows, our world is running backward, or forward, or maybe sideways, in a way as yet ungrasped. I am sure somebody will come up with a name for what is happening, but I cannot imagine how everything around us and everything within us can be fixed. What is happening involves the invisible, the quanta of which we are created. Whatever is actually occurring, there is constant breaking news about how it will be handled. Speculation, really, concerning what comes next, which is why I am writing an account. And that is The Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. So, I brought a lot of books into my library in the month of May, but I feel good about how much I want to read them. I feel good about them. I'm excited to read them. I'd love to hear what you think of them. If you've read any of these books, if you have recommendations based on these, let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back until next time, hopefully with a smaller book haul. Happy reading.